The night my wife told me to ask my daughter for money instead of my millionaire son, something inside me finally broke. I had spent my entire life believing that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and loved my family enough, they would stand beside me when life knocked me down. I was wrong. What hurt the most was not the cancer growing inside my chest or the bills piling up on my kitchen table. It was realizing that the people I would have given my life for had already decided I was worth less than the money sitting in someone else's bank account. They thought I had nothing left to offer. They had no idea that fate was quietly preparing an ending none of us could have imagined. My name is Daniel Harper, and I was 58 years old when everything changed. I lived in a small 3-bedroom house just outside Rosenberg, Texas. It was never supposed to be my forever home. Years ago, when I bought it, I imagined it would be our first step towards something bigger. I thought success was just around the corner. Instead, decades slipped by before I even noticed, and the house grew older right along with me. The porch paint peeled away one season at a time. The gutters rattled every time it rained, and every weekend I promised myself I would finally fix them. Somehow there was always another bill to pay first. One humid evening in late July, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unopened envelopes. You learn to recognize bad news before you even read it. Thick envelopes from insurance companies never contain miracles. Bright red utility notices never congratulate you for being a loyal customer. Every letter waiting for me represented another problem I no longer had the strength to solve. I wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold and wondered how many more weeks I could keep pretending everything was under control. Across the room, my wife, Caroline, scrolled through her phone without saying a word. We had been married for more than 30 years, but lately it felt like we were strangers, forced to share the same address. The silence between us was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, uncomfortable, and filled with things neither of us wanted to say out loud. Then her phone suddenly rang. The moment she saw the caller, her entire face lit up. It happened so quickly that it caught me off guard. A warm smile spread across her face, her eyes sparkled, and her voice became softer than I had heard in years. She practically rushed to answer the call. "Hello, sweetheart. Tell me everything." I smiled without thinking. "Is that Ethan?" "Tell him I said hello." She never looked at me. Instead, she turned her back, walked toward the living room, and lowered her voice as though I had become someone she needed to hide from. I could still hear enough. $12 million. "Honey, I always knew you would make it. You definitely inherited that business instinct from my side of the family. Your grandfather would be so proud of you." I remained frozen in my chair. 12 million. That was the amount sitting in my own son's investment accounts. My son had become one of the youngest partners at his investment firm in Houston. Every family gathering somehow turned into another celebration of his success. Caroline talked about him as if he had built America with his bare hands. Friends at church knew more about Ethan's promotions than they knew about my name. I was proud of him too. At least I wanted to be. No father wants his child to fail. But somewhere along the way, my success stopped mattering, and my failures became the only thing anyone remembered. When Caroline finally returned to the kitchen nearly 20 minutes later, the smile disappeared the instant she looked at me. It was almost like watching someone remove a mask. She slid an electric bill across the table. "You need to handle this," before they shut the power off. Again, that was it. No question about how I was feeling. No concern over the cough that had kept me awake. Every night for almost a month. Conversation, just another bill. I nodded quietly. Deep down, I knew this story was never really about unpaid bills. It was about value. When a man can no longer provide, some people stop seeing the man altogether. I wish I could tell you my family became cold overnight. The truth is far worse. It happened so slowly that I barely noticed until it was too late. 10 years earlier, people had called me one of the smartest real estate investors in Fort Bend County. I wasn't rich, but I had built a reputation for spotting opportunities before everyone else. I studied maps, population growth, and future highway projects, while other investors chased quick profits. I believed patience created wealth. Then I found 60 acres of land that everyone else ignored. It looked worthless, swampy, overgrown, far outside the city. But I knew the new highway expansion would eventually pass nearby. When it did, That forgotten land would become incredibly valuable. Invested almost everything I owned. Friends congratulated. Bankers praised my vision. Even Caroline loved, telling people how clever her husband was. For a while, I believed I had finally built the future my family deserved. Then disaster arrived without warning. One aging oil pipeline beneath a neighboring property ruptured. Thousands of gallons of crude oil seeped underground before anyone realized what had happened. Within weeks, federal investigators locked down the entire area. My land became part of the environmental cleanup zone. I couldn't sell it. I couldn't build on it. Couldn't even borrow against it. The property that had once represented my family's future instantly became an anchor, dragging every part of my life underwater. Banks cancelled my credit. Lines business partners disappeared. Investors stopped answering my calls. Everything I had spent decades building collapsed faster than I ever imagined possible. And while strangers blamed bad luck, my own family blamed me. Losing my business was painful, but watching the people I loved slowly lose respect for me was something entirely different. Money has a strange way of changing how people measure your worth. When I was closing profitable land deals, everyone wanted my opinion. Family dinners were filled with questions about investments, future plans, and dreams. The moment everything collapsed, those conversations disappeared. Instead of asking how I was holding up, people only wanted to know how I planned to fix the disaster. It was as if the husband and father they had admired for years had vanished overnight, replaced by someone they could barely tolerate. Every morning I woke up believing I could rebuild my life, but every evening I went to bed feeling like I had disappointed the people who mattered most. With no investors willing to work with me and every bank refusing another loan, I accepted the only steady job I could find. I became a forklift operator at a distribution warehouse outside town. It was honest work, and I never felt ashamed of earning a living. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. Just a few years earlier, I had spent my days negotiating land purchases inside air-conditioned offices. Now I spent 12-hour shifts loading heavy pallets, while diesel fumes filled the warehouse and sweat soaked through my shirt before lunchtime. By the time I reached home every night, my back ached so badly that climbing the front porch steps felt like another shift of work. Still, I never complained because providing for my family, no matter how difficult life became, was still my responsibility. My son Ethan never accepted any of it. He was barely 21 when everything fell apart, old enough to understand that our lives had changed, but too young to understand why. Instead of seeing an accident that destroyed years of hard work, he saw a father who had failed. The family vacation we cancelled became proof that I had ruined his future. The spring break trip his friends enjoyed without him became another reason to resent me. Every conversation between us grew colder than the last. I tried explaining the oil spill, the government restrictions, and the years of legal battles that followed, but none of it mattered. Somewhere inside his mind, the story had already been rewritten. His father had made bad decisions and everyone else had paid the price. Facts never stood a chance against a belief someone desperately wanted to keep. Thankfully, not everyone in my family looked at me that way. My daughter Emily had always seen people differently. While Ethan remembered everything we lost, Emily remembered how hard I fought after losing it. She watched me leave before sunrise every morning and return home long after dark without ever giving up. She never measured my value by the size of my paycheck. To her, I was still the father who helped with homework, fixed broken bicycles, attended every school play, and stayed awake all night whenever she got sick. She understood something her brother never did. A man's bank account can disappear in a single day, but his character is revealed by what he does after everything is gone. A few evenings after Caroline celebrated Ethan's latest financial success over the phone, Emily stopped by the house carrying a warm casserole wrapped in aluminum foil. The smell filled the kitchen before she even set it on the counter. It was my favorite meal, cooked almost exactly the way my own mother used to make it. She hugged me tightly, stepped back, and immediately frowned. She had noticed the cough I had been trying so hard to hide. It had started as something small a few weeks earlier, but lately it refused to go away. Every morning I convinced myself it was allergies, and every night I promised I would make a doctor's appointment soon. Emily wasn't fooled for even a second. She folded her arms and looked straight into my eyes. "You are still coughing, aren't you?" I forced a smile and blamed the Texas heat, the dust at the warehouse, and every excuse I could think of. She listened quietly until I finally ran out of explanations. Then she shook her head. "Dad, you were seeing a doctor this week, and this isn't a discussion." I wanted to argue because that's what fathers do when they don't want their children worrying about them. But something about the concern in her voice stopped me. She wasn't asking because she doubted my strength. She was asking because she loved me enough to notice what everyone else ignored. 2 days later, I sat inside a small examination room, waiting for the results of several scans I never expected to need. The room felt colder than it should have, and every second seemed to last forever. When Dr. Mason walked inside carrying a thick folder instead of a simple clipboard, I knew my life was about to change again. Doctors who have good news don't spend several minutes choosing their words. He closed the door behind him, pulled up a chair, and looked directly at me with the kind of expression no patient ever wants to see. He spoke calmly, but every sentence landed like another weight on my chest. There was a mass on my lung. The good news was that it appeared operable. The bad news was that waiting too long could allow it to spread beyond the point where surgery would help. Time was suddenly something I no longer owned. Weeks mattered now. Every day I delayed could cost me the chance to watch my daughter build her future, or someday hold my grandchildren. I nodded while he explained treatment options, but my thoughts had already drifted somewhere else. I wasn't thinking about dying. I was wondering how a man who could barely keep his electricity on was supposed to pay for cancer surgery. As if reading my thoughts, someone from the billing department entered a few minutes later, carrying another folder. She apologized before saying a single word, which told me everything I needed to know. My insurance would not fully cover the procedure my surgeon recommended. Before they would even schedule the operation, I needed to pay a deposit of $3,500. She offered payment plans, financing programs, and several brochures filled with smiling faces that somehow made the situation feel even worse. I thanked her politely, shook her hand, and walked back to my truck feeling completely numb. For almost an hour I sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. I checked my savings account again, even though I already knew the balance. I calculated every possible way to borrow the money, but each answer ended exactly the same. My credit had never recovered from the land disaster. Banks would never approve another loan. Friends had their own families to support. The only person I knew who could solve this problem without even noticing the money was my own son. Ethan had millions. $3,500 was less than he probably spent entertaining clients during a single weekend. Yet asking him felt harder than hearing the cancer diagnosis itself. Pride is a stubborn thing. Even when life is falling apart, a father wants to believe he can still protect his children instead of depending on them. But eventually reality leaves you with only one choice. I took a deep breath, picked up my phone, and prayed the little boy I used to know was still somewhere inside the successful man he had become. I stared at Ethan's name on my phone for nearly 5 minutes before I finally pressed the call button. It sounds ridiculous now, but asking my own son for help felt harder than hearing the doctor tell me I had cancer. Parents spend their entire lives protecting their children. We work overtime so they can sleep peacefully. We skip meals so they never have to. Somewhere deep inside, asking them for help feels like admitting you failed at the one job that truly mattered. Still, life has a way of humbling a man. I swallowed every ounce of pride I had left and prayed the son I raised would hear my voice instead of my failures. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. Even before he spoke, I could hear expensive glasses clinking together and people laughing in the background. Music played softly somewhere behind him, and someone nearby was talking about ordering another bottle of rare whiskey. It sounded like one of those upscale restaurants where the appetizers cost more than I spent on groceries for a week. Ethan finally picked up, but he sounded distracted, almost annoyed that his evening had been interrupted. He greeted me quickly, then asked if whatever I needed could wait because he was celebrating a major business deal with clients. I almost told him never mind. My finger even tightened around the phone as I considered hanging up before embarrassing myself. But then I remembered the doctor's words. Weeks, not months. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about staying alive. I quietly asked him for just a few minutes. He sighed heavily, stepped away from the noise and told me to make it quick. His impatience stung more than I expected, but I pushed through it. I explained everything from the beginning. I told him about the coughing that never stopped, the scans, the tumor, the surgery, and finally the insurance gap that left me needing $3,500 before the hospital would schedule the operation. When I finished speaking, silence filled the line. For one hopeful moment, I believed he was processing what I had said. Maybe he was shocked. Maybe he was reaching for his wallet. Maybe he was trying not to cry. I allowed myself to believe that because every father wants to think the goodness he once saw in his child is still there somewhere. Then Ethan finally spoke and every bit of hope disappeared. His voice was calm, almost emotionless. He reminded me how difficult his own life had been after my business collapsed. He talked about the opportunities he believed he had lost because of my financial mistakes. He said he had spent years working harder than everyone else just to escape the shadow of my failures. According to him, sending me money now would only drag him backward after everything he had sacrificed to build. He wasn't talking to me like a son speaking to his father. He sounded more like a banker rejecting another risky loan application. I tried to interrupt him, explaining that this wasn't another investment or another business deal. I wasn't asking him to rescue a failed company. I was asking him to help his father survive long enough to see another birthday. Before I could finish, he cut me off. He said hospitals offered payment plans for people who couldn't afford treatment. He told me I needed to start taking responsibility instead of expecting others to clean up my problems. Then he said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. He told me he had a reputation to protect, and he couldn't keep carrying my dead weight. Those words echoed inside my head long after the call ended. I didn't even realize he had hung up until I looked at the silent phone in my hand. There I was, sitting alone inside my old pickup truck with cancer growing inside my chest, while my millionaire son returned to his celebration because helping his father might somehow damage his image. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. Oddly enough, I didn't cry. Some pain cut so deeply that tears simply aren't enough. After several minutes, I called Caroline. I wasn't asking her for money. I knew she didn't have that kind of savings. I only hoped she could convince Ethan to reconsider. Surely a mother could remind her son what family meant. I explained everything all over again, my voice growing weaker with every sentence. Before I even finished, she interrupted me. "Do not ruin this for him." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. I asked what she meant. She told me Ethan had worked too hard to escape the problems I created, and that I had no right to pull him back into my financial mess. Then, almost as an afterthought, she suggested I ask Emily instead. She even called our daughter by the wrong name, because she was so busy defending Ethan that she barely thought about what she was saying. I quietly ended the call before she could say anything else. I remained parked outside the hospital until sunset painted the sky orange. Hundreds of people walked past my truck that afternoon, without realizing an entire family had fallen apart inside it. I kept asking myself where everything had gone wrong. Had I loved Ethan too much? Had I protected him from hardship for so many years that he never learned compassion? Or had success simply changed him into someone I no longer recognized? No matter how many questions I asked, the answers never came. 2 days later, Emily invited me to lunch at a small diner she loved near her school. It was one of those old family restaurants where everyone knew the waitresses by name, and fresh coffee never stopped flowing. I promised myself I wouldn't mention the surgery. I couldn't bear the thought of asking my daughter for money after my own son had turned me away. She worked as a fourth-grade teacher. Her salary barely covered rent, groceries, and student loans. She had enough burdens without adding mine to the list. I decided I would smile, eat lunch, and somehow figure everything else out later. The moment I sat down across from her, she studied my face for only a few seconds before quietly placing her menu aside. She had always been able to read me better than anyone else. She asked what was wrong, and I instinctively lied. I blamed the heat, the warehouse, and my allergies again. She didn't believe a single word. She reached across the table, gently squeezed my hand, and waited. There was something about the way she looked at me that made pretending impossible. My defenses crumbled. I told her everything. Not just about the cancer, but about the hospital deposit, Ethan's refusal, and Caroline telling me to ask my own daughter instead. Every sentence made me feel smaller. I hated myself for placing that burden on her shoulders. Before I could even finish apologizing, Emily quietly reached into her purse and placed a thick envelope on the table between us. Then she turned her phone toward me. The screen displayed an approval notice from a payday loan company. I stared at it confused until she smiled through tears and pushed the envelope closer. "Dad, stop worrying about the money. There are $2,000 in that envelope, and I sold my car this morning. The loan covered the rest." For several seconds I couldn't even breathe. She had sold the only car she owned, the car she needed every single day to drive to school, just so I could have a chance to live. I shook my head over and over, trying to hand the envelope back, but she refused to take it. She squeezed my hand tighter and smiled the same warm smile she had worn since she was a little girl. "Cars can be replaced, Dad, you can't." At that moment, every wall I had built around my emotions collapsed. I broke down right there in the middle of that little diner. I cried harder than I had the day my business failed, harder than I had after hearing the word cancer. Complete strangers looked over from their tables, but I didn't care. My daughter wrapped both hands around mine and simply sat with me while I cried. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't keeping score. She wasn't wondering whether I deserved her help. She loved me. And in that moment, I realized something that would change every decision I made for the rest of my life. Not every wealthy person is rich, and not every person with an ordinary paycheck is poor. Emily had almost nothing in her bank account, yet she gave me everything she had without asking for anything in return. I had no idea then that her act of love was about to lead to the greatest twist either of us could have imagined. The surgery would save my life, but only because my daughter was willing to sacrifice her own future first. And just beyond that miracle, another one had been quietly waiting for me for 10 long years. The morning of my surgery arrived faster than I expected. Long before sunrise, Emily drove me to the hospital in a borrowed car from one of her co-workers because she no longer had one of her own. Watching her thank someone for lending her transportation broke my heart all over again. Every mile we drove reminded me that she had given up her independence just so I could have another chance at life. She tried to keep the mood light by joking about my terrible taste in music and how stubborn I had always been, but I could see the fear hiding behind her smile. She was doing everything she could to keep me calm while carrying a burden no 26-year-old should ever have to carry. Inside the hospital, nurses prepared me for surgery, while doctors moved from room to room with practiced confidence. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing except me. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering if it would be the last thing I ever saw. When Emily leaned over to hug me before they wheeled me into the operating room, she whispered that everything would be okay. Her voice was steady, but I noticed the tears she was trying so hard to hide. I smiled and told her that if anyone could bully death into giving up, it was probably her. She laughed through watery eyes, squeezed my hand one last time, and watched as the nurses rolled me away. The bright lights above me slowly blurred together as the anesthesia began taking effect. My final conscious thought wasn't about money, cancer, or even fear. It was about my daughter standing alone in that hallway after selling her future to protect mine. I silently promised myself that if I somehow survived this operation, I would spend every remaining day finding a way to repay the kindness she had shown me. I had no idea that life was already preparing an answer far greater than anything I could imagine. When I finally opened my eyes again, everything hurt. My chest felt like someone had parked a truck on top of it, and every breath reminded me that my body had been through a war. Machines beeped quietly around my bed, while nurses checked monitors and adjusted medication. Hours later, Dr. Mason walked into my room with a tired smile that instantly eased the fear I'd been carrying for weeks. He gently placed a hand on my shoulder and told me the words I had desperately hoped to hear. They got it all. The tumor had been removed successfully. The margins were clean. The surgery had gone exactly as planned. I closed my eyes and thanked God for giving me another chance. Not because I wanted more money, not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted more time with the one person who never stopped believing in me. For the next 2 weeks, I recovered at Emily's small apartment. Caroline never offered to take care of me. She never called to ask how the surgery went. Not once did she show up with soup, medicine, or even a simple message asking if I was still alive. At first I told myself she was busy. Then I stopped making excuses. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't discovering that someone hates you. It's realizing they simply don't care anymore. Emily's apartment was tiny. A single bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and an old pull-out couch that became my temporary bed. Every morning before sunrise, I heard her quietly getting ready for work. Without her car, she now depended on the city bus. I watched her leave the apartment before daylight, carrying lesson plans in one hand and coffee in the other, walking nearly half a mile to the nearest bus stop because she had sacrificed everything. For me, without asking for recognition, that bus schedule hanging on the refrigerator became something I couldn't stop looking at. Every time I saw it, guilt settled deeper into my chest than the surgical scar ever could. My daughter stood outside in the Texas heat every morning, waiting for public transportation, because her father couldn't afford cancer surgery. Meanwhile, somewhere across Houston, my son was driving a luxury car to business lunches, worth more than Emily earned in a week. The unfairness of it all haunted me every single day, yet Emily never complained, not once. She came home exhausted after teaching energetic fourth graders all day, cooked simple dinners, checked my incision, reminded me to take my medication, and stayed awake until she was sure I was comfortable. Some nights I caught her grading papers at the kitchen table, long after midnight, because she refused to let her students suffer simply because life had become difficult. Watching her made me realize something I should have understood years earlier. Character isn't revealed when life is easy. Character is revealed when someone has every reason to walk away and chooses to stay. 16 days after my surgery, something unexpected happened. Emily had already left for school when someone knocked on the apartment door instead of leaving the mail in the box downstairs. I slowly walked over, still moving carefully because every step pulled at the stitches across my ribs. The mail carrier handed me 2 certified envelopes that required a signature. One came from the Environmental Protection Agency, a name I had grown to hate over the previous decade. The other carried the logo of a company I didn't recognize. I almost tossed both letters onto the kitchen counter. For 10 years, every letter from the government had delivered the same disappointing message. Cleanup still in progress. Property restrictions remain in effect. No development permitted. No construction allowed. No timeline available. I expected nothing different. Still, something inside me insisted I open them. I sat down at Emily's little kitchen table and carefully unfolded the government letter first. As I read the first paragraph, my heart began beating faster. I read it again, then a third time. Surely I had misunderstood, but I hadn't. The environmental cleanup was officially complete. Federal restrictions had been permanently lifted. After 10 long years, my land was finally free. I couldn't move. I simply stared at those words while memories flooded my mind. 10 years of paying taxes on property I couldn't use. 10 years of watching my credit collapse. 10 years of being blamed for circumstances no one could have predicted. 10 years of believing everything I had worked for was gone forever. And then it wasn't. With trembling hands, I reached for the second envelope. Inside was an official purchase offer from a commercial development company. While my property had remained frozen under government control, the highway expansion I had predicted years earlier had finally been completed. New businesses, shopping centers, and neighborhoods had transformed the entire area around my land. What had once been considered worthless, swamp property had become one of the most valuable commercial locations in the county. The company wanted all 60 acres. Their opening offer, $15 million cash. I stopped breathing for a moment. Just 3 weeks earlier, I'd been sitting in my truck wondering how to find $3,500 to save my life. Now someone was offering me $15 million. I didn't jump up, I didn't scream, I didn't celebrate. Instead, my eyes slowly drifted toward the refrigerator. Right there, held in place by a small school magnet, hung Emily's handwritten bus schedule. Every route, every transfer, every departure time a daily reminder of the price she had paid so I could still be alive. Tears filled my eyes as one thought echoed, louder than every other. She is standing at a bus stop right now because she chose me over herself. At that exact moment, everything became perfectly clear. I wasn't thinking about luxury homes, I wasn't thinking about expensive cars, and I certainly wasn't thinking about sharing the news with the people who had abandoned me when I needed them most. I quietly folded both letters, picked up my phone, and made one decision that would change every single life in my family forever. I wasn't going to call Caroline. I wasn't going to call Ethan. The first person I needed to speak with was my attorney. And before the sun went down that day, I would begin putting a plan into motion that neither my wife nor my son could ever undo. I sat at Emily's kitchen table for nearly an hour, with those 2 letters spread out in front of me. Every few minutes I picked them up again, just to make sure they still said the same thing. 10 years of fighting, 10 years of carrying debt that wasn't my fault. 10 years of being treated like a burden, and suddenly everything had changed in a single morning. Most people probably imagine I felt excitement. The truth is, I felt something much quieter. It was peace. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I wasn't wondering how I would pay another bill or whether another collection notice would arrive in the mail. The storm that had followed me for 10 long years had finally passed. I reached for my phone and scrolled until I found the number of my old attorney, Michael Lawson. We hadn't spoken much since my business collapsed, but he was one of the few professionals who never turned his back on me. Even when I could barely afford his services, he treated me with respect. He answered on the second ring, and before he could finish asking about my recovery, I interrupted him. I told him about the letter from the government, the commercial, developer's offer, and the $15 million purchase price. Silence filled the line. For several long seconds, I thought the call had disconnected. Finally, Michael let out a slow breath. "Daniel, if those documents are legitimate, your entire life just changed." I looked toward the refrigerator again. "No," I answered quietly. "My life already changed the day my daughter sold her car so I could survive. This money is just catching up to what she already proved." There was another pause before Michael asked me a question I wasn't expecting. "What exactly do you want to do?" Most people would have answered that question by talking about vacations, investments, or dream homes. My answer came without hesitation. I want to make sure the only person who stood beside me is protected for the rest of her life. Michael didn't respond immediately. He knew there was more behind those words. Then another memory surfaced. 5 years earlier. A memory I hadn't thought about in months. Caroline had insisted we meet with Michael after another creditor threatened legal action over the land. Ethan had attended that meeting too. He was already building a successful career in finance, and he spent most of the meeting explaining why Caroline needed to protect herself from my debts. At the time, I hadn't argued. I understood her fear. She wanted the family home placed entirely in her name. She wanted her retirement accounts protected. She wanted complete legal separation between her assets and the land that had nearly destroyed our lives. Back then, it felt like another painful reminder that my own wife no longer believed in me. Now, that memory suddenly meant something entirely different. "Michael," I said carefully, "do you still have that property separation agreement Caroline signed?" His voice immediately became more serious. "I do, why? I want you to read every word to me exactly as it's written. No summaries, no shortcuts. I want every sentence." About 2 hours later, my phone rang again. I answered immediately. I could hear papers shuffling on Michael's desk before he began reading. According to the agreement, Caroline voluntarily surrendered every present and future legal claim connected to the 60 acres of land. The language was absolute. Any future increase in value, appreciation, development profits, or proceeds from the property belonged exclusively to me because the land had been legally converted into my separate property years earlier. Michael stopped reading. "Daniel, she doesn't own $1 of that property anymore. Legally. She gave it away herself." I closed my eyes. Not because I felt victorious, because I finally understood something life had been trying to teach me. Sometimes, people become so desperate to avoid sharing your failures that they accidentally surrender the right to share your blessings too. Michael continued explaining. The agreement had been drafted exactly the way Caroline requested. She wanted complete protection from any debt connected to the land. That protection worked both directions. If the property became worthless, It was entirely my responsibility. If it became priceless, it was entirely mine. There was no legal argument around it. The paperwork was airtight. Then another question crossed my mind, one that mattered far more than the money. "Michael, can anyone challenge it?" He answered without hesitation. "Not successfully, especially since your son witnessed the agreement and encouraged the separation himself." I couldn't help smiling. Not because they had lost, because life had quietly delivered justice without me lifting a finger. After ending the call, I sat alone for several minutes, thinking about everything that had happened. Then I made the most important financial decision of my life. I called Michael back. "I want you to accept the offer. Pay every debt connected to that property. Every loan, every tax bill, every outstanding balance. I don't want to owe anyone another penny. Then I want you to establish an irrevocable trust." Silence. Michael spoke carefully. "Who will be the beneficiary?" "Emily." He cleared his throat. "How much of the proceeds?" "Every dollar that's left after the debts are paid." Another long silence followed. "Daniel, that's almost $15 million, are you sure?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. I've never been more certain of anything. Michael hesitated. "What about Caroline? What about Ethan?" I slowly looked toward that bus schedule hanging on the refrigerator. The paper had become wrinkled from weeks of use. Emily woke up before sunrise every morning because she no longer owned a car. She stood outside waiting for public transportation in the Texas heat. She worked all day teaching children. Then she came home and spent her evenings taking care of me without asking for recognition. Meanwhile, my son had refused to help save my life because he didn't want to damage his reputation, and my wife told me not to bother him. The answer suddenly became very simple. Fairness already happened. It happened the afternoon Emily pushed that envelope across a diner table. Everything after that was simply the consequence of choices people made for themselves. Michael quietly asked if there was anything else I wanted included in the trust. Yes, buy Emily a home. Not in my name. The trust owns it. Pay off every debt she has. Replace the car she sold. Fund the reading program she's always wanted to create for children who can't afford tutoring. Make sure nobody can ever challenge any of it. I want every document impossible to overturn. Michael laughed softly. "You've already planned this, haven't you?" "No," I answered. "My daughter planned it the day she decided my life mattered more than her own comfort. I'm just finishing the story she started." The paperwork moved quickly. Within days, the sale closed. Every outstanding debt that had haunted me for 10 years disappeared forever. The trust became official. Emily knew nothing about any of it. She continued waking up before dawn to catch the bus every morning, completely unaware that her entire future had already changed. I kept everything secret, not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted everything legally completed before anyone found out. Deep inside, I knew exactly what would happen once the news became public. Neither Caroline nor Ethan would come asking about my health. They wouldn't apologize. They wouldn't ask how I recovered from surgery. They would come for one reason, money, and this time I would finally be ready. 8 days passed after the paperwork was finalized, and life settled into a strange kind of peace. Every morning I felt a little stronger. My breathing became easier, the pain in my chest slowly faded, and for the first time in years I slept through the night without waking up worried about another bill. Emily still had no idea what had happened. She continued catching the city bus before sunrise, teaching her students all day, and coming home with enough energy left to ask how I was feeling. Watching her live so humbly, while unknowingly becoming one of the wealthiest women in Texas, reminded me why she deserved every single dollar. Wealth had never changed her heart, because she had never chased it in the first place. I knew the truth would eventually come out. Property sales that large always become public records, especially commercial developments. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. Even then, I never imagined how quickly the news would travel. Late one Wednesday afternoon, someone pounded on Emily's apartment door so hard that the walls actually shook. The knocking wasn't impatient. It was desperate. Emily had just returned home from school, and she exchanged a confused look with me before opening the door. Standing outside were Caroline and Ethan. The confident smile Ethan usually wore had vanished. His expensive suit looked wrinkled, his tie hung loose around his neck, and sweat covered his forehead even though the hallway was air-conditioned. Caroline looked equally unsettled. For the first time in years, neither of them seemed in control of the situation. What surprised me most wasn't that they had come. It was that neither of them asked how I was recovering. Not one word about the surgery. Not one question about the cancer. They walked into that apartment with only one thing on their minds: money. Ethan barely waited for the door to close before speaking. His voice was rushed and shaky, nothing like the calm executive I remembered from family dinners. He told me he had discovered a commercial property transfer while reviewing public business filings. The development company had purchased 60 acres of land in my name for $15 million. He demanded to know if it was true. I calmly looked him in the eyes. Yes, the sale closed last week. For a second, absolute silence filled the apartment. Then everything exploded. Why didn't you tell us? Ethan's voice echoed through the room. He accused me of hiding millions from my own family. He insisted I had secretly known the land would become valuable all along. According to him, I had forced everyone to live modestly while waiting for the perfect moment to reward my favorite child. Caroline immediately joined him, saying that after 31 years of marriage she deserved half of everything. They weren't asking questions anymore. They were making demands. I listened without interrupting. Sometimes people reveal more about themselves when you simply allow them to keep talking. Ethan paced across the apartment, growing angrier with every sentence. He reminded me that Caroline was still legally my wife. He insisted that every dollar from the land sale belonged to the family, not just me. Then he crossed a line I never expected him to cross. He smiled, not a happy smile. The smile of someone who believed he had already won. He told me his attorneys were already preparing divorce paperwork for Caroline. They planned to accuse me of hiding marital assets, freeze every account connected to the sale, and drag me through court until I surrendered. He proudly explained how financial litigation worked, as though I should admire his strategy. He had no idea I had already seen every move before he made it. I slowly stood up from the chair. My ribs still hurt from surgery, but somehow the pain didn't bother me anymore. I reached into the folder resting beside me on the kitchen table and removed 2 documents. Without saying a word, I slid the first document across the table toward Caroline. She looked down. Within seconds, the color drained from her face. She recognized it immediately. It was the property separation agreement she had signed 5 years earlier. The very agreement Ethan had encouraged her to create. I spoke quietly because I no longer needed to raise my voice. 5 years ago, both of you sat across from me and decided you needed protection from my failures. You were afraid creditors would come after everything we owned. So you separated the property. You took the house. You protected your retirement accounts. And you made sure the 60 acres belonged entirely to me, along with every debt attached to it. Caroline's hands began trembling as she continued reading. I gently tapped one paragraph with my finger. Read that sentence again. The one that says regardless of future appreciation, proceeds or value. She read it. Then read it again. Her breathing changed. She finally understood. By protecting herself from the risk, she had also surrendered every legal claim to the reward. Ethan grabbed the agreement from her hands and quickly scanned the pages. His confidence disappeared almost instantly. No, he whispered. This can't be right. I calmly nodded. It is. Your own attorney drafted it. You witnessed it. You encouraged it. The land stopped being marital property the day your mother signed those papers. Every dollar from that sale belongs only to me. There isn't a judge in Texas who can change that. For the first time since arriving, neither of them had anything to say. The room became so quiet that we could hear the air conditioner humming above us. Then Ethan tried one final argument. Even if that's true, you still owe this family something. After everything we've been through, you can't seriously keep all $15 million. I reached for the second document. It wasn't another legal contract. It was a copy of the trust agreement. I placed it in front of him. I didn't keep it. His eyes dropped to the first page. Beneficiary Emily Harper. Irrevocable trust. His face turned pale. "No," he whispered. "No." "You didn't?" I looked directly at him. "Every debt connected to the land has already been paid. Emily's payday loan disappeared the same day the trust became active. She has a new home, a new car. Every student loan she ever owed has been erased. The reading program she's dreamed about for years is fully funded. Every remaining dollar belongs to her, legally, permanently, irrevocably. There is nothing left for anyone else to claim." Caroline slowly lowered herself into a chair, as though her legs could no longer support her. She looked older than I had ever seen her. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Daniel." "Why?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because when I needed $3,500 to stay alive, our son told me to ask the hospital for a payment plan. You told me not to ruin his celebration. And your daughter sold her car. She gave me everything she had without asking what she would get back. The truth is, she already inherited something far more valuable than money. She inherited compassion. The money simply followed it." No one spoke. Emily stood frozen near the doorway with tears running down her face. She hadn't known about the trust. She hadn't expected any of this. She quietly shook her head. "Dad, I never helped you because I wanted anything." I smiled. "I know. That's exactly why you deserved everything." I walked over and wrapped my arm around her shoulders as gently as my healing ribs allowed. Then I looked back at Caroline and Ethan one final time. "For 10 years, both of you believed my biggest mistake was losing that land. You were wrong. My biggest mistake was believing family was measured by blood instead of loyalty. Today I finally learned the difference." "Please leave." Neither of them argued. Neither of them threatened another lawsuit. Neither of them apologized. They simply walked out in complete silence, carrying nothing except the consequences of choices they had made years earlier. After the apartment door closed, Emily leaned against me and cried. I held her the same way I had when she was a little girl frightened by thunderstorms. Only this time the storm was finally over. A few months later, Emily opened the tutoring center she had dreamed about for years. Children from struggling families received free academic support, school supplies and meals after class. Watching those classrooms fill with smiling faces brought me more happiness than any luxury home or expensive car ever could. My cancer remained in remission, my debts were gone, and for the first time in over a decade, peace returned to my life. People often ask whether I regret giving away $15 million. The answer is simple: not for a single second. Money always finds the people who chase it. But love reveals the people who deserve it. And in the end, I didn't lose a fortune. I simply discovered who my real family had been all along.